Okay, great. Thanks very much, Karen, for this interesting opportunity. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make the meeting in Washington a little while back, but I have enjoyed catching up on the webinar. So what I thought I would do actually has quite a lot of complementarity with Mike's presentation. My focus on agricultural development and international perspective. But what I would just like to do, I think it's a traditional view of world markets that focuses on developments in the rich countries, and the big agricultural countries. You know, the focus of negotiations tends to be on the debates between the US, the European Union, Japan, Canada, Australia, and I think the world has really changed. I'll provide a little information, background information on that. What I want to emphasize, though, many of the rural development challenges that Mike identified have very strong parallels in developing countries. I'd like to talk a little about potential high-impact interventions and then research questions. If we look at the pattern of world agricultural trade, we go back to 1992. The high-income countries, and here I'm using a very narrow set. You know, it's the countries that identify as not being developing at the WTO. So the United States, the European Union countries, Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Very few other countries in that category. They accounted for about 60% of world exports, 59% there on the right-hand side, and trade between high-income countries from say the US to Japan and the US to Europe and so on, almost 40% of world agricultural trade. You know, a lot of our thinking, a lot of the frameworks for recent trade negotiations, such as the Doha agenda, were really being constructed in the 90s. Now move forward just 20 years, and you see that exports from the high-income countries to other high-income countries are down to, it's actually slightly under 20% of world agricultural trade. Most of the WTO rules focus on that sort of trade, where you've got high-income countries subject to full disciplines exporting to another high-income country. But the exports of high-income countries have dropped to just over 40% of world exports. Nearly 60% of world exports are from developing countries. So there's a very, very different pattern of world trade. I know many of the negotiators are aware of that at the operational level, and of course, analysts at USDA are very, very aware of the importance of crop developments in developing countries. But I think we still have a way to go in thinking about these issues. When you're looking at why it is that developing countries have increased their importance in exports, a lot of it is to do with a very big increase in productivity between just from 1990 through to 2013. Here, if you look at net agricultural output per hectare or per acre, in developing countries it was substantially below that in developed countries, but it's actually risen above over this period, much higher rate of productivity growth. There's also been some expansion of land area in agriculture in developing countries, some contraction in the industrial world, industrial countries. That's also influenced this. And related to this is a staggering change in agricultural policy in developing countries. If you go back, and this is work from Kim Anderson's work, into the 50s and 60s, agriculture was heavily taxed in developing countries. Right through until the 90s, it was taxed. You know, the prices that producers got were on average below world prices. In rich countries, it's been the opposite for a long time. Agriculture has been protected. But now we see in developing countries, the average rate of protection is positive in developing countries as well. This is a very substantial change. Mostly it's an improvement. That rate of taxation of agriculture was very, very bad in developing countries, especially for poor people, poor producers in rural areas. I think it's very important to remember, and this is where the similarity with Mike's presentation comes in, there are many challenges remaining in rural areas in developing countries. 3/4 of the world's poor are in rural areas, just about everywhere. The poverty rate is much higher in rural areas than in urban areas. On average, 18 in rural, 11 in urban. That's an average sample from one of my studies of food price impacts on poverty. And in many developing countries, the difference is absolutely enormous. If you look at China, for instance, still substantial poverty in rural areas. This is at the World Bank's extreme poverty level of $1.90 per day. In urban areas, almost no poverty in China. Very, very few exceptions. One case where poverty rates in rural and urban areas are similar is Indonesia, where there's been a lot of focus on rural development. So this rural poverty and food insecurity, and we're talking very, very serious problems of poverty and food insecurity. What drives that? We've got many people in rural areas with limited skills, poor education, many people using low productivity technologies. Even in countries where technology productivity has been rising rapidly, you have this problem of slow adjustment that we used to call the farm problem. The big gaps between urban and rural incomes that emerge. Rural areas are often remote with very high trade costs, so producers get low prices for the goods they sell. Everyone pays high prices, both for inputs and for consumer goods. And then, of course, there are often barriers to trade, both domestically and internationally, that have the same effect. Lower the prices for goods sold and raise them for inputs and consumer goods. The rural poor, as well as being on average poor, having low incomes, are often very vulnerable, even those who are above the poverty line. A large share of their income spent on food. Many people are vulnerable to high food prices. And many of those people who are vulnerable to high food prices may even be farmers. They're farmers who are net buyers of basic staple foods. Farm output's often volatile, makes their income volatile, and creates vulnerability to poverty. And of course there are the many other forms of vulnerability, vulnerable to other shocks like health, loss of assets, especially in conflict areas or where property rights, land titles are poorly defined. High impact interventions. Let's think about interventions to raise real incomes in rural areas, interventions to deal with volatility. Some of these, I think, are fairly clear in principle, although hard to achieve. Skill upgrading, rural education, the importance of rural education. Many people in poor countries, in rural areas, have poor, very limited access to education. I think the United States has been a huge leader in this over the last 200 years. Improving technology, research and development, the payoffs here tend to be enormous. A dollar spent on R&D often seems to yield something like $10 in return. Accelerating adjustment, off-farm opportunities. Many countries, you have problems that inhibit people who would like to leave farming and allow others to move to greater scale, can't do so because there are limitations on land title that make it hard to leave agriculture. Or in some cases, you have barriers to movement out of rural areas. The residence permit systems in China and some other countries. Improvements in infrastructure, hugely important. I'd like to emphasize reducing barriers to trade. Again, it'll help raise those returns from goods and services sold and lower the costs of inputs and consumption goods. I think one of the things that's often not well understood is why trade raises incomes. One of them is the ancient issue of factor endowments, one of the original foundations of trade theory. Countries with a lot of land tend to be natural exporters. Countries with little land tend to be importers. There are huge gains. There are huge differences in endowments, huge gains from trade. Countries with better technology, the original Ricardian argument, no matter if you have better ways to produce, that gives you a competitive advantage. And there are benefits to rich countries trading with poor. There are benefits to poor countries trading with rich. It's the theory of comparative advantage. It's not about absolute productivity differences. Gains from trade often allow you to produce, opening to trade often allows you to use better quality inputs. That can have important benefits, and greater variety of inputs and products that can also raise productivity. And of course, trade in agricultural products helps dietary diversity. Managing volatility, social safety nets, opening to trade. In many countries, a very popular thing is to reach for things like price insulation and safeguards. And that raises all sorts of difficulties. Social safety nets are going to be individually and collectively effective. You can transfer to the poor who need food. That will help them meet their basic needs for food security. These measures are all allowed by WTO. There are no obstacles there. The alternative measure that countries often use is things like putting on export restrictions when food prices rise. They cause substitution towards food by all consumers and create, they're much inferior to social safety nets. There's a very widely held perspective that opening up to trade increases price instability. But I think it's very important for us as economists to point out that it actually, opening up to trade, helps to reduce instability. Most of the food price volatility, most of the shocks come from output volatility. If you have a diversified source of supply of agricultural goods, then the overall volatility will be much less. I mean, this is the basic principle of diversification. There's some very interesting recent work by Burgess and Donaldson found that in India there was almost a natural experiment. As regions were added to the rail network, the famine risk dropped dramatically. It was all about diversifying sources of supply. That's in the 19th century. Price insulation, the measures like export restrictions when prices rise, attractive to individual countries. It stabilizes domestic relative to world prices. But this is a zero-sum game. It's a collective action problem. It destabilizes world prices. Collectively, if everybody does the same thing, this is ineffective. The analogy Kim Anderson and I have used, this is like everyone standing up in the grandstand to get a better view. It can rearrange volatility by shifting it to the countries that insulate less than the average. But obviously everybody can't insulate more than the average. This is not like where we're going, where all the children can be above average. Price insulation, just to show you the extent of this, the extent to which world prices end up much more volatile than domestic prices. Here's an average of food prices in developing countries. The world price much more volatile than the domestic price, largely because of the price insulation that tries to shift volatility to other countries. Challenges in managing these problems, I mean, the critical things taking into account collective action problems. Lots of proposals look at the impact of this sort of policy on one country at a time, and then create collective action problems. We're seeing collective action problems with ill-conceived proposals for trade restrictions. You see these proposals coming up in the United States, you see them coming up in Europe. Often it's people in industrial countries wanting to restrict imports from developing countries. At the WTO, you see proposals for special safeguards that would clearly exacerbate problems of rural poverty. So some research challenges. What are the best approaches to reducing poverty? especially in rural areas, which is where 3/4 of the world's poor are. I think the other ones, how do we maintain productivity growth in the face of slowing yield growth in many countries and globally? This is especially important given continuing population growth and risks of climate change. And then I think in all of this, we need to think about new approaches to trade negotiations. The traditional approach formed in an era when agricultural trade was dominated by developed countries really needs to be revisited. Now that 80% of world trade, only 20% of world trade is between the industrial countries who have been the focus of most approaches to trade negotiations. And especially important in all of this to keep in mind that the idea is to deal with the collective action problems such as price volatility that results from each individual country trying to insulate itself from shocks to world markets. So I hope that provides some food for thought and look forward to any questions.